One, thank you for joining. We'll be starting in just a few minutes in case there's any late sign-ins, but hang tight. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. I'll have you know that we will be answering questions at the end of this presentation. So be sure to utilize the question and answer feature of Zoom, and we'll do our best to get to all the questions at the end. Thanks. We'll start in a few minutes. All right, I think we'll get started. Again, thank you for joining us on this Friday afternoon. I hope that the start of your semester has been going crazy, not going crazy, ours has been crazy. I hope it's been going well for you and that you're enjoying the first few weeks of classes. Um, and if any of you are new to UMass Lowell, of course, welcome. We hope you enjoy your time here. Um, my name is Patrick Truvy. I'm an International Student and Scholar Advisor here in the International Student Scholars Office. I'm joined by fellow advisor Emily Fritz, who's also here, who is going to help me moderate your questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So again, we will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. So please utilize that question and answer function, and we'll get to as many as we can. As you can see, today's presentation is about optional practical training, or OPT, work authorization. So this is especially pertinent presentation for those attendees who will be graduating in May and plan to work in the United States beyond graduation. I will say we will touch briefly on the STEM extension of OPT and what that means. And the reason we'll touch on that briefly is because in a few weeks' time, we will actually be conducting a specific STEM OPT coffee hour itself. And we'll reference that so that you can attend that as well. But for the sake of this conversation today, it's going to be more about OPT, that's pre-completion OPT and post-completion OPT. So we'll get started here. Firstly, as we do with any presentation, I want to point out our website. We take great pride in keeping it updated and providing a comprehensive guide for really anything you will need while an international student here at UMass Lowell, specifically with OPT. You'll find all this information that I will discuss today and more related to what is OPT, how to apply, issues related to maintaining status, reporting your employment to the SEVP portal, and much more. So if you miss anything today, by all means, our website has this information. And of course, we're always available during our advising hours. So we'll start. What is OPT, or optional practical training? It's a type of off-campus employment authorization afforded to all F1 visa holders. So there may be some J1 students here on the presentation today, and they would not be eligible for OPT, but rather academic training. And by all means, if those students are here, I'd be happy to answer any questions related to academic training. But this presentation is about F1 OPT. Each F1 visa holder is eligible to apply for a period of 12 months of OPT per degree level. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, if you're in a STEM field, you'd be eligible for an extension of that. Of this 12 months of OPT, you can use it prior to graduation, or in most cases, students will save it to use after graduation. So the prefixes pre and post, that's pre and post OPT, refer to when in relation to a student's completion date that you work or apply for this work authorization. As I said, it's more common for students to save up that OPT time to use after graduation because it is a limited amount of time and very precious. So most of the times we'll see students saving up that full 12 months to use when applying for post-OPT. If you do decide to apply for and are granted pre-OPT, that is deducted from your 12-month total. So we're going to kind of discuss what that means and how much time is deducted, but it's just something to keep in mind as we move along. So these are the general eligibility requirements for F1 visa holders to apply for OPT. Firstly, you must have completed 1 year of study in your academic program, and that's an active SEVIS status, meaning you've come to the United States. The ISSO has activated your SEVIS record. You have to, of course, be in F1 status at the time you apply for OPT. You could not have participated in more than 12 months of full-time CPT in that degree level for which you're applying for OPT. And we get this question a lot. How does my CPT affect my OPT eligibility? And in virtually all cases, it will not, unless or until you've used or were approved for 365 days of full-time CPT. Your OPT eligibility is unaffected. In general, no student ever comes close, partly because of the CPT eligibility requirements in general, but also because the ISSO would monitor a student's authorized CPT to ensure you did not exceed that 365-day threshold. You cannot be in a pathway program or have a language I-20 in order while applying for OPT. Um, any employment while engaged in OPT has to be in your field of study as listed on your I-20. And it's key, as we'll discuss in several slides, that you are able to determine when your completion date, that's the completion date of your program, is. So to that, both pre and post OPT are based off a student's anticipated completion date. And this will be confirmed by both you and an academic advisor when you're actually applying for OPT. Completion date for graduate students refers to the date, well, excuse me, I should say, non-coursework students that are either thesis students or dissertation students, your completion date refers to when you'll actually complete your program of study. That's successfully defend your thesis, dissertation, and submit it to the library. Whereas a coursework student, their completion date is pretty easily determined and defined. It's the end of a given semester. So for all my May graduates, which I presume many of you are, and if you are a coursework student, meaning you're a non-thesis or a non-PhD student, your completion date is virtually always going to be May 15th, 2021. So as you're applying for your post-OPT, that will be your completion date. You'll note that that's not necessarily the same date as the commencement date or your degree conferral date. In this case, it happens to be the commencement date, but oftentimes a student may complete a program and the degree for various reasons may be conferred at a later date. That's irrelevant. From an immigration perspective, our chief concern is your completion date, which is when you've completed your last academic requirement. As I mentioned before, all of your OPT employment must be directly related to your field of study and commensurate with your degree level. So we have an example here about what that sort of means in the event of you're a computer science major. Students often come to us to make a determination. They ask us, I have this job offer. Can I do it? Is it in my field of study? Unfortunately, the ISSO isn't able to necessarily make that determination. As you can imagine, we work with students across disciplines. And frankly, my expertise in physics or plastics engineering is not sufficient enough to be able to tell you definitively that it is in your field of study or not. I would depend. Typically, if a student is concerned that it is, it might not be. But in most cases, if you feel that you could justify that your program of study allows you and has prepared you to undertake that specific job, then it likely is fine. For a legal determination, if you're really on the fence, the ISO would have to defer to an immigration attorney to uh, take on that legal responsibility. But in the vast majority of cases, students find jobs in their field of study, no question. They understand that it is, so it's typically a non-issue, but it's certainly something to keep in mind. So this is what we're trying to get. When you apply for OPT, essentially it's a two-step process. You will apply for OPT to the ISSO, completing our OPTE form, providing necessary documents and information for us to ultimately issue you a new I-20 that recommends OPT. So it says, I say recommend because we can't authorize the OPT itself. Some of you may have been on CPT previously, or maybe are on CPT now, and you would know that the ISSO itself can authorize CPT, and we authorize that through the issuance of a new I-20 that allows you to work for that employer. OPT is dissimilar to that in the sense that while we provide an I-20, there is this second step here of having to actually send that to USCIS with various other application materials to actually get that approval. Once approved, you'll get this handy card here. This is your employment authorization document, or EAD. You'll see that it has biographical information as well as validity dates on it, which will dictate when your work authorization begins and expires. And we'll just touch on that in subsequent slides. We have a note here at the bottom here that USCIS is currently taking 75 plus days to process EADs. I would say in the current immigration climate, it's certainly at least 75 days, sometimes more. So the USCIS isn't bound by any sort of processing timeline. So if a student were to ask me, and they do during advising appointments, how long will it take? I would typically say expect it for it to take about 3 months, 90 days or so. If it gets to you quicker, great. But in the vast majority of cases, it'll take a full 3 months to get an approval. It varies from time of year to the year itself, but in general, 90 days is a safe bet. So we're going to talk a little bit about pre-completion OPT. We'll go through it relatively quickly, only because pre-OPT is used far less than post-OPT. But as I've referenced, pre-OPT refers to OPT applied for and approved for work authorization in your field of study off campus prior to actually completing your program of study. As you'll see here, the pre-OPT EAD end date can be no later than your completion date, because at that point it would be post-OPT. Um, in the vast majority of cases, pre-OPT can only be full-time if you are a master's thesis or PhD student who has completed all of their required coursework and research credits and are just working on their thesis or dissertation. As the next bullet point will say, in the vast majority of cases, pre-OPT, particularly during an academic term, has to be on a part-time basis, which means it's under 20 hours a week. Unless, of course, you're applying for pre-OPT during summer break, in which case you could theoretically apply for full-time pre-OPT. Unlike post-OPT, where you're required to report your employment, and we'll discuss that at length, pre-OPT does not require you to report your employment. You will not be given access to what is called the SEVP portal, which, when on post-OPT, allows you to report your employment. And of course, as we mentioned before, when you're on pre-OPT, you have to ensure that the employment you undertake is in your field of study and otherwise satisfies the OPT requirements. And finally, as a reminder, a pre-OPT time you use will be deducted from your post-OPT time. So an easy example to think of is if you were applying for pre-completion OPT for a given term, let's say it's 4 months for easy ballpark numbers here, and it's on a part-time basis. So that 4 months on a part-time basis will count as 2 months of the total 12 months. So if you were to do this if you were to use these 4 months of part-time pre-OPT during your final semester, at the time you were applying for post-OPT, you'd be applying for the additional 10 months or so, because of course you only get 12 total. So this is a filing timeline for pre-completion OPT. The regulations state that you can apply for pre-OPT as early as 90 days prior to a requested start date. Because OPT applications typically take around that time to be approved, students often want to apply earlier. Personally, I've had success giving students pre-OPT I-20s even in advance of that 90-day window, and they were approved. It is risky because the regulations do state that you have to apply within 90 days. But what we found and our colleagues in the field have found is that USCIS is often flexible with that timeline for pre-OPT. For post-OPT, they're much more strict. So if you're going to apply for pre-OPT and you want to apply well in advance, the ISSO will likely give you the I-20 with the caveat that USCIS could, at their discretion, deny that application. So just something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind here is this bold bullet here towards the middle of the slide here, is that you cannot apply for your post-OPT until you have received your pre-OPT card. So that becomes an issue if you have a job offer in your final semester and you're hoping to work on pre-OPT and then go right into post-OPT. So there's no gaps in employment. Depending on when that pre-OPT is actually approved, if it's delayed, and knowing that you can't apply for that post-OPT until that pre-OPT is approved, that may result in you having some gaps in employment between the two authorizations. Hope that makes sense. But if you have any questions, by all means, we're happy to address that. So some special considerations to keep in mind. Of course, you will not be authorized to work on or off campus beyond your I-20 expiration date unless you have your post-OPT I-20. Your pre-OPT EAD, should you receive it, does not permit you to work beyond the expiration date of your I-20 itself. Even if you get that pre-OPT EAD, of course, as we mentioned, the expiry date will be no later than your completion date itself. An EAD for pre-OPT is useless as far as your ability to apply for or work on post-OPT. And you cannot work on either your pre-OPT or post-OPT until you receive the actual work card, the EAD, and it is the start date. So in many cases, you may receive an approval and get that work card even in advance of the date that you picked to begin that work. If that's the case, that's great. You know you'll be able to work on that start date you picked, but you cannot work in advance of that, even on a volunteer basis. So how is post-OPT different? So it's different in the sense that your maintenance of legal status is no longer contingent on you being a student enrolled in courses or even having a valid I-20 at that point, because of course your I-20 will expire when you're on OPT. It's your maintenance of status is now based on the fact that you have approved OPT and work authorization in the United States. Like pre-OPT, or I should say, unlike pre-OPT, post-OPT must be full-time. The regulations define that as at least 20 hours per week. So when you're on post-OPT and you're looking for jobs, you between and while you can work multiple jobs, between all employment opportunities, all must be in your field of study, and and between the jobs, they must add up to at least 20 hours a week. Another key point here is you have 90 days of unemployment while on post OBT. Pre OBT, the unemployment is not an issue, but while on post OBT, you're granted 90 days in which you can be unemployed from the start date of your EAD. Um, we're finding that recently, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement (ICE) has been actively sending notifications to students who may have exceeded that 90-day clock, alerting them that their records will be terminated. In previous years, that has sort of been a threat, and they've been saying they will be doing that, auto terminating student records. But now it seems they're willing and able to act on it. So now, more than ever, it is imperative that once you're on post OBT, that you report all of your employment changes to the SEVB portal within 10 days of any change. Failure to do so would indicate on your CVIS record that you're potentially unemployed when you are indeed employed. So ICE doesn't know the difference if you don't report it. So if you forget to report that you're working and you exceed the 90 days, it's very possible, if not likely, that ICE will terminate your CVIS record as a failure to report employment. Upon receipt of your post OPT EAD, you're going to receive an email from SEVP asking you to set up your SEV portal account so that when you do secure employment, you can log in and report that employment information. I actually was just on the phone with SEVP today for an unrelated issue, and he actually wanted me to remind our students, and I'll do it here. What a better opportunity than now, that to be sure to create your portal account within 2 weeks of receiving that email, and to log into it at least once every 30 days to keep the record active, even if nothing has changed. This is just an advice from an SEVP rep in general, so certainly something to keep in mind. The filing timeline for OPT is a little different than pre-OPT in that it's much stricter. Um, as I said, USCIS sometimes will allow flexibility as far as the filing timeline for pre-OPT, but post-OPT is strict, and that you cannot apply for post-OPT any earlier than 90 days from your completion date. So for my May graduates, again, knowing now, if assuming you're a coursework student, that May 15th is your completion date, the earliest that you can apply for OPT and the earliest that the ISSO can actually issue you that OPT I-20 is in or around February 15th. So while you can start preparing your OPT e-form materials and even submit it if you'd like now in advance of that, just know that the ISSO advisor cannot actually issue that I-20 until February 15th at the earliest. So you can either apply 90 days prior to completion date or as late as 60 days after your completion date while you're in that grace period. I wouldn't typically recommend you waiting into the grace period, because with OPT taking 90 days or so to process, if you wait until the summer months to actually apply for OPT, you're looking at not being able to work until probably sometime in the early fall. So in general, because OPT applications are recently taking so long to process, I would typically advise students to apply as soon as possible, if not within the first few weeks of being eligible to. So for my May graduates, I would it'd probably behoove you to apply for your post OPT sometime before the end of February, if not early March. That's probably a good window to shoot for. And the last bullet point here says your start date for post OPT must fall within the 60 days following your completion date. So as we'll discuss too when we get to a slide about picking your OPT start date, just remember that when you apply for OPT, your start date of OPT has to begin within 60 days following your program completion. So as we said here, things to excuse me, things to consider when picking a start date. So as we know, that start date has to be anywhere within your 60-day grace period. But students often come to us and say, well, how do I know which date to pick? And that really depends on you, and every student sort of has different circumstances. Some things to consider when picking that start date would be your job search. Where are you in the job search process? Have you had interviews? Are you confident that you'll get a job soon? Do you have a job offer? Did you plan to travel after you complete your program, maybe work a little later and pick a later start date? What's the job market in your field? Is it hard to get jobs? Are jobs readily available? Based on all of those factors, you want to determine where within that grace period you want to request your OPT to start. If, for example, a student is convinced or fairly confident that it may take them a long time to actually secure an OPT job, they may want to pick a later start date. They may want to pick the latest start date. So again, for my May graduates, they may want to pick that mid-July OPT start date. And that may make sense for that student. But if you do that, and as this bullet point here says, you cannot change your requested start date once you apply for the OPT. So if you come to me at the end of February, you apply for OPT, you're requesting a July 15th start date. You send the application off and you're finishing up your program, waiting for your approval. And then in May, your dream job comes along and says, hey, we want to hire you. Can you come work for us in 2 weeks? You're going to have to explain to that employer that you can't, that you won't be able to work for them until the middle of July. And that employer may not want to wait around waiting for you. So that's sort of the risks you run with picking a start date late, or if you pick a start date that's too early, say you're very confident you'll get a job and you want to start working right away, if that date comes and you still don't have a job, that's when those 90 days of unemployment will start ticking down, perhaps earlier than you wanted. So these are all things to consider when picking the start date. It's hard to do, I know, because I assume that many of you maybe haven't even begun the job search process yet. You know, it's only early February prior to your graduation. But nevertheless, with the OPT processing timeline being what it is, you're sort of forced to make a guess or an educated guess as to when you want to start working and when that makes sense based on your circumstances. Once we issue the OPT I-20, you must send the application and USCIS must receive it within 30 days of us issuing the I-20. To that, students often ask, oh, what if my OPT application gets denied? And I would tell you that in my experience, virtually the only times that an OPT application would be denied is if you send in an application and forget to include uh, one of the documents. So, for example, your filing fee check, they'll deny it. Or a more common reason for denial is that students send in their application beyond 30 days from when we issue the I-20. So if you remember anything about the filing process, is that once you get the I-20 from us, be sure to send those materials to USCIS soon and certainly within 30 days. And finally, remember, you cannot work until you actually receive the EAD card and it's the start date you've picked. So if you picked a July 15th OPT start date and you get your EAD in June, that's great. You have your card in hand. You know that you'll be able to work on July 15th, but you can't actually work until then. Excuse me one second. We often get questions about travel and OPT, and there's a lot of misinformation about that. Students often think, well, I can't travel. What is my status? How do I get a visa? This and that. It's all myths. You're never a prisoner in the United States. You can always travel. Uh, in general, what I tell students is while you're on OPT, you're still an F1 student, and you're an F1 student until you're not. And what I mean by that is until you change your status to, say, an H1B, or until you go back to school, or until you leave the United States, you'll continue to be an F1 student, although pursuant to the F1 status through your OPT. So with that, travel is possible just as it would be as you know you're a student. Um, there are a couple things to consider, however. You should not travel outside of the United States um, once your I-20 is expired until you receive the actual EAD. In general, I would probably advise you not travel at all while the OPT application is pending with USCIS. Although you can theoretically come and go from the U.S. with a valid visa, through the expiration of your I-20. But of course, with your I-20 expiring based on your completion date, um, your ability to return to the country is not only based on the fact that you have a visa and now an expired I-20, but the fact that you have an EAD card that shows a continuation of your F1 status. So if you remember anything, just remember, do not travel beyond your completion date unless or until you have your EAD card in hand. When traveling on OPT, here's a list of things you'll want to carry with you. It's very similar to what you need as a student with a few more things involved. Of course, your passport, valid for 6 months beyond the expiration of your EAD, a valid F1 visa stamp, a Form I-20 with the OPT information or either approval or recommendation on it, along with the travel signature. Um, and then in addition to that, we'd also you should of course, your OPT EAD, as I've said. In addition to that, we'd ask that you bring a letter of employment here, again, from your OPT employer, just confirming you are indeed working, as well as photocopies of recent pay statements. Again, just showing that you are employed by an OPT employer and therefore maintaining your status. Now, if you do not have an employer, you can still travel while on OPT. You just, of course, wouldn't have the letter of employment. But you just want to keep in mind that you only have 90 days of unemployment. So if you're traveling to the United States and you're using a good chunk of that time, when you come back in, CBP may ask, well, where are you working? How are you maintaining your status? And at that point, you would just have to explain to them, oh, I'm not working yet, but I have X amount of days of unemployment available to me, and I'm returning to the United States to seek employment. Um, so just to be clear, you can travel while on OPT, whether you have a job or not. But if you don't, you need to be sure that you will not exceed your unemployment time while traveling. And of course, the bottom point is there, do not mistakenly enter as a tourist, because it will invalidate your F1 CVIS record. And with that, your OPT, making you ineligible to work. So be sure that when you come back to the United States while on OPT, you're presenting the appropriate F1 visa documents. So how do you apply? First, you should look through our OPT guide on our website, which has a lot of information we're discussing here in maybe a more comprehensive way. But in general, you're going to complete our OPT form, which is found on the forms and guides section of the ISSO website. That e-form itself is going to ask you to include, you're going to have to reference what your completion date is. You're going to have to pick what your OPT start date is at that point. You're going to include your academic advisor. He or she will also confirm that you are indeed completing when you say you are. You'll upload a copy of your transcript, your passport, I-94, the form I-765, which is the actual government form that you use to apply for work authorization. We want you to upload that so we can review it and make sure you complete it correctly. And then you'll submit it. It'll come to an ISSO advisor for processing. And ultimately, we're going to issue you a new I-20 that will not only shorten your shorten your I-20 to your completion date, but also have an OPT recommendation on page 2 that will list that you're requesting OPT from X date to Y date based on the information you've put on the e-form itself. Once you have that, you'll send the I-20, or rather a copy of the I-20, along with a $410 filing fee and various other supporting documents to USCIS for processing. In about 3 months or so, hopefully sooner, you're going to receive both an approval notice and the EAD, typically in separate mail, to the address that you've listed on your OPT application and the I-765 specifically. What we recommend to students is to have your name clearly marked, excuse me, on your mailbox, and be sure to alert USCIS if you were to change your address while your application is pending. There's been too many times where the post office was unable to deliver a card because they could not verify that the applicant actually lived at that address. And I'll tell you from my experience, if there's an issue with the post office delivering that card, it is going to take a remarkably long time to track it down and get it back to you. And of course, as we mentioned, without the card, you can't actually work. So do anything you can, if it takes a giant blinking neon sign, to let the post office know that you indeed live at this address so that they can feel confident delivering those sensitive government documents to you. So we have some special issues here, some common questions we get. It says here, what if I'm unable to complete my program as anticipated? So sometimes a student will apply for OPT nice and early, say in middle February for my May graduates. They'll send in their application to USS. They're in a waiting period. They're waiting for their OPT to be approved, and they come to us in May and say, "Hey, Patrick, you know what? I actually wasn't able to complete on time, and I need another class because I failed it, or I got a grade below a B, and you need to retake it." And that can be a serious problem. Theoretically, you can work to withdraw that pending OPT application. We would then extend your I-20 to allow you to complete your last class, and you would reapply again based on that new completion date. But there are often issues with that. Sometimes USCIS doesn't receive, or will receive but won't process an OPT withdrawal on time, or they'll process it at an arbitrary time, months from when you actually submitted it. That could lead to confusion as far as a duplicate OPT app when you eventually reapply for it. If, for example, your OPT was approved before you're able to extend your I-20, then you're stuck with that OPT time, but you can't actually work pursuant to it unless or until you actually finish your program of study. So in general, if you understand one thing from the slide, it's that when you're applying for your OPT, be very confident that you will indeed be able to complete as of the date you're telling the ISSO and the US government that you will be able to complete. There is some flexibility for thesis students and dissertation students, but for coursework students, you need to be very confident that you'll be able to finish when you're saying you are. So again, for the May graduates, if your GPA is maybe a little low and you need to get 2 A's in your 2 remaining classes this term in order to graduate, or else you'd have to take additional courses, you might want to hold off on applying for OPT until a little later into the semester when you're maybe more confident that you will indeed be able to graduate. Um, I know you're eager to apply and you want to, you have faith in yourself to get that done. But I assure you, if something goes wrong and you weren't able to complete, the potential issues associated with that are pretty great. So just in general, when you're applying for OPT and you're confirming you're completing your program on a given date, I just ask that you are very confident that that is going to be the case, because otherwise it could be big trouble for your status. Just 1 second. All right. So as far as what jobs you can do on OPT, there are several situations. The first here, number one, is standard paid employment. That's an employer offers you a job, pays you, and you go work for them. That's the most common example, right? And that's totally fine as long as it's in your field of study and at least 20 hours a week. Number two, employment by multiple employers. So as I said previously, you can work for multiple employers while on OPT, so long as that all jobs are in your field of study and that between the jobs you're working at least 20 hours a week. These jobs can be paid or unpaid, although when they're unpaid jobs, it becomes a little more risky because while from the immigration side, OPT is permitted to be unpaid employment, from the labor law side in the US, an employer just can't hire you and not pay you. So, so there are certain circumstances, for example, many students work at UMass Lowell on OPT and they're working pursuant to approved unpaid internships. And then Human Resources does some vetting to ensure that there's no labor laws violated, and that's okay. But you can't accept a job offer from an employer who wants you to work and do business for them, but not pay you. That's illegal from a labor perspective. Number three, self-employment. Yes, you can be self-employed and create your own business and work for yourself. On OPT, the regs allow that. We have here that you should keep documentation of any business licenses, your finances, evidence that you are doing business in the United States, because what will become an issue if and when you apply for a STEM extension of your OPT is the issue of an employer-employee relationship. In fact, self-employment while on STEM is very hard to justify, if not impossible, because of that employer-employee relationship. Consideration. So basically, USCIS says that someone needs to be supervising you while on STEM OPT. So while on post OPT, that requirement doesn't exist, or it's much more vague, and it would allow for entrepreneurship and self-employment. For STEM, it gets much more difficult. And of course, we will discuss that at our forthcoming STEM OPT coffee hour in more detail. Number four, employment through an agency, contractor, third party. We know that that's very common, particularly within STEM fields where you're hired by employer A, you're their employee, but they sort of assign you to company B to do that work. That is allowed on OPT and STEM OPT. There's certain documentation that we'd want to collect or you'd want to keep to evidence how that business arrangement works, but it's certainly possible. And finally, as I kind of touched on this before, number five is volunteer unpaid internships. Unpaid work is permitted, though it cannot violate labor laws. You'll want to keep, because there won't necessarily be payroll records, you'll want to keep records yourself, or you'll want to ensure that you can get records from HR that evidence how many hours of work you've done, because of course, in the case of an audit, you want to be sure that you can show USCIS that you're working at least 20 hours a week in your field of study. So we talked about this a little bit before. The SCVP portal, a relatively new, within the past couple of years, system that allows students to self-report their employment while on post-OPT. As I mentioned before, pre-OPT students do not have to do this, but it's required of post-OPT students to report their employment right to their SCVP portal for SEVIS to review. The portal requires you to report new employment, the termination of a previous employment, any changes to employment directly to the portal all yourself. You don't have to report to the ISSO. Though, When you do make these changes to the portal, we highly recommend you contact our office or complete our post-OPT I-20 reprint form so we can give you an I-20 that's updated that now reflects either your new employment information, your changes to employment, your ending of an employment, so that you can have an I-20 with the most updated employment information. There's often cases where you may be locked out of that portal. It's a very finicky sort of system. And if that's the case, you can reach out to our office, and in many cases, we can reset your portal access. I will touch on here briefly. STEM OPT students do have access to this portal, but you cannot add new employment information to that portal. That requires you to submit some documentation to ISO to do that. But for the sake of my OPT students, you will have access to the SVE portal account, and it is up to you to report that employment. And remember, this is very important because failure to update your employment means that your 90 days of unemployment start ticking down, perhaps unnecessarily. So be sure that you're reporting that information. So we want to put here some COVID-19 considerations that may affect you or your eligibility for OPT. So firstly, we know that many students have decided to stay home, whether by choice or by circumstance, because of the COVID-19 situation. This may affect your OPT eligibility if you will not have completed a full academic year, which is one of the eligibility requirements, with full-time registration in active SEVIS status. So for example, if a student began their program overseas, or maybe even did several semesters overseas before joining us here at UMass Lowell, and say we didn't activate their SEVIS record, meaning they weren't actually here until their last semester, the completion of their final semester wouldn't be enough, time to make them eligible to apply for any off-campus work authorization. So that's something to keep in mind as far as how quickly you need to be here if you're currently in the United States, so we can ensure that we can activate your SEVIS record, and then from there, you have to complete 2 consecutive semesters of full-time registration, and then you'll be eligible. Another important point here, the current SAVP guidance issued last August, that sort of outlined what schools and students need to do in light of the COVID-19 situation, does not provide clarification as to whether you can apply for OPT outside the United States. So it doesn't say that you can or cannot. So because it does not say that specifically, we have to go back to the regulations, which say very specifically that you have to be in the United States to apply for OPT. So with that, if you're a student who perhaps is graduating in May and you're outside of the United States but plan to come back at some point, you should do that before your completion date, and you will need to apply for OPT once you're back in the US. So that's OPT in a nutshell. We're going to discuss, like I said, very briefly, the STEM OPT process, because I know that the two subjects often bleed into each other. But again, we have a few slides left. Again, utilize that Q&A feature. I see many of you ask questions, and we'll get to those when we're done here. Again, like our OPT, take a look at our website. The STEM webpage is a comprehensive guide to everything involving STEM. Most importantly, as you see, we put it here twice, the reporting requirements. Just like OPT, even more so, STEM OPT requires you to not only report your employment, when there is a change, but also every 6 months. And that requires additional documentation and all sorts of other compliance-related issues that you want to be privy to. And again, that will be discussed at our STEM coffee hour in more detail in just a few weeks. In general, a STEM extension is the ability for students in the STEM fields, that's science, technology, engineering, math, to apply for an additional 2-year extension of their OPT, assuming they meet certain eligibility criteria. This is referred to the STEM extension of OPT. To be eligible, you must be on post-OPT and otherwise maintaining your F1 status. You have to have a STEM degree. You have to be actively employed with a company that's E-verified. You have to be, of course, in a position in your field of study. It has to be a paid position, unlike OPT. It has to be for a minimum of 20 hours a week, and that's for each employer, not in total. They will have to complete what's called a Form I-983 training plan, which is a 5-page, 5-page document that sort of outlines, it's signed by you and the employer, that outlines sort of what your job responsibilities are, how you're supervised, etc. And you cannot have accrued the 90 days of unemployment while on post-OPT. So you have to be inactive, F1 OPT status. You haven't had to have violated that with your unemployment time, employed by an E-verified employer, paid 20 hours a week in your field of study, and you would theoretically be eligible to apply for this 2-year extension. Like OPT, you have to file for the STEM extension within 90 days of your post-OPT expiration date this time around. They have to, and to that, they have to receive it by your OPT expiration date. So you can apply as early as 90 days from your OPT expiry, but USCIS must receive your STEM OPT application prior to your 12 months of OPT expiry in order to be valid. Um, we urge students to apply for STEM extensions as early as they're able to, because in the event that, say, you apply late, we're now past your OPT expiry date, and then your STEM application is denied. At that point, you'd be ineligible to apply for your STEM extension because we're now past your OPT expiry. So with that, it's a good rule of thumb to, like post OPT, apply as soon as you're able to or very shortly thereafter. Unlike post OPT, where you need to have applied and receive an approval to begin work, with STEM OPT, you need to have only filed the petition and have it received by USCIS. From that point, you're granted an additional 180 days of employment beyond your OPT expiry while USCIS adjudicates your petition. So if your OPT expires on one day, you've applied for STEM maybe weeks prior, we get to that date, you don't have to stop working. You can work for another 180 days. Within that time frame, of course, USCIS will approve or in very rare cases deny your STEM application. So of course, you'll continue to work for the rest of that 2-year period. So the Form 983 is sort of the big difference between the OPT and the STEM OPT. It's that 5-page training plan I referenced previously. That has to be signed by both you and your employer. It dictates where you're working, who's supervising you, what you're doing, and it has to be updated with each and every employer. There's evaluations, the lattermost page of the form itself, that have to be completed every 12 and 24 months. And when you end an employment, again, I'm glossing over this because this will be discussed in more detail at our STEM coffee hour. That's just something to keep in mind. As I mentioned, there's reporting. It has to be done on STEM OPT. You not only have to keep your SCV portal information up to date, like you do on post OPT, but you also have to submit 6-month employment confirmation reports, that even if nothing has changed with your employment, to essentially say, yes, this information is still accurate. I still work at X employer. And at the 12-month and 24-month mark, you actually have to submit evaluations, which is part of the Form 983, signed by both you and your employer, attesting to what you're doing and how you're continuing to work pursuant to your STEM OPT. It's, now more than ever, failure to submit these required reports can result in some serious status issues. So it's imperative to understand, as you go off onto a STEM extension, what those requirements are so that you don't miss them. A new 983 has to be submitted to the ISSO and consequently to SVP every time there's a termination of your employment. So you have to give that within 10 days. Every time you add a new employer, so if you change jobs, any change in existing employment that is not a material change. So let's say your job title changes, or changes in employment that is a material change, meaning your job responsibilities might change, your work location might change, etc. All has to be reported to the ISSO. Unlike post OPT, where you are responsible for making all of these changes on the SEV portal yourself, on STEM, you need to alert us of these changes through the appropriate e-form so that we can make those updates for you. So that's a key difference between OPT and STEM OPT. As I mentioned before, it's important now more than ever that you're aware of and abide by the reporting requirements of both OPT and STEM OPT. Failure to report your employment on time on OPT or STEM OPT, or failure to submit the appropriate 6-month evaluation, or you exceed your unemployment time and we have to backdate that you actually were working and not exceeding your unemployment time. All of those things are now more likely leading to request for evidences, or RFEs, at the H-1B visa petition stage. So it's imperative that you understand what is required to report while in OPT and STEM OPT, because I would hate for years from now a simple mistake to prohibit you from moving on to an H-1B or employment-based green card or what have you. So it's ultimately your responsibility as a visa holder to ensure you take care of those things. But of course, we exist, the ISSO exists to help guide you. So any and all questions, by all means, reach out to us. As I said, with post OPT, you have a total of 90 days of unemployment, which you cannot exceed. However, once you've applied for STEM OPT and we're at the validity date of that STEM OPT, you're granted another 60 days for a total of 150 days of unemployment that you can use throughout your 36-month period. So I want to be clear. Just because you're a STEM OPT student does not mean you get 150 days of unemployment off the bat. You get 90 days available to you within your first 12 months of OPT. And if you go on to your STEM extension, you're granted another 60 days that is tacked on to whatever unemployment time you have remaining from your initial 12 months. And we're leading up to this. Our STEM OPT coffee hour is going to be held 2 weeks from now on Friday, February 19th at 3 p.m. Like with this presentation, you're going to receive an invitation for a Zoom link. You can log in. Emily, who's here today, will be conducting that presentation. There'll be a Q&A session. So if you are a STEM student, I'd behoove you to log in here. I don't believe that any students on this presentation are currently on OPT, but if you are and you're interested in applying for STEM, by all means, you should attend this coffee hour, which they'll go much more into depth about the STEM OPT process. And with that, I know I've been having you ask questions. I think for this, depending on if we have a lot of questions, we might hold off on answering STEM related questions just for the sake of time. But by all means, if you have those questions and we can't get to it, attend this coffee hour, ask the question there, and we'll be absolutely sure to get to it. I want to remind you of our advising hours, of course, even remote Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursdays from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. You can now use our automated self check-in system, which you should have gotten an email about earlier this week, which will allow you yourself to sign in for for advising hours to be added to our queue for an advisor to call back. Frankly, the ISSO is finding it harder to field the calls for advising hours, and we feel the self-service login allows you to do that at your convenience without the need to call us. Then, of course, the advisor can call you right back and answer any question you have on a one-to-one basis. So be sure to utilize those advising hours to ask any questions, OPT, STEM, OPT related, or otherwise. I think at this point, that's our presentation. So I see there's plenty of questions that you've asked. We're going to try to get to them all. If you have any questions at this point, please utilize the Q&A feature, and we'll try to get to them all.
Okay, we have some questions here. The first question we have is, I have a question about OPT when applying for jobs right now. Often you are asked if you are authorized to work in the US. When I do not have my OPT just yet, should I answer yes or no to this question?
Sure. So this is a question we get a lot as well, and it's a good question. It's more of an ethical question than an immigration question, but I'm happy to sort of address it either way. You're right. A lot of applications will ask not only are you authorized to work in the US, but if you will require visa sponsorship in the future. The answer to the lattermost is yes. And the answer to the former question could potentially be no, because you don't have that authorization yet. However, I fear that if you answer those questions honestly, that you're likely not going to get an interview, because they're going to say, oh, well, you're not authorized to work. We can't hire you. So again, it's an ethical question. I can't tell you what to do, but I would tell you to answer those questions in any way that you think will get you an interview, at which point you can advocate for yourself and explain, well, no, I don't have the authorization yet, but I will. I am eligible for it. I am eligible to apply for it. I will have it. Whereas answering just no right off the bat will likely mean that you won't even get an interview. So I hope that makes sense. So it's a strange way to answer the questions. You're not necessarily answering the questions completely honestly, but otherwise I don't see you having a good chance to get in front of the employer to explain to them, no, I have OPT. I have potentially up to 3 years to work for you. So I would hate to see you lose out an opportunity because you answered the question so strictly. So I hope that makes sense, but we can discuss more at advising if you have any more questions.
Okay, next question. I am currently a PhD student, but I am switching to the master's program next week. And this means that I will graduate this semester. So in this case, I'm wondering if I'm allowed to apply for the OPT I-20 right now.
This is a good question. If you're a PhD student and you're deciding, oh, I'm just going to get a master's, there's a couple things to think about. First, I presume that your dropping to the master's level would still require you to complete some academic components, whether it's courses, thesis credits, whatever it may be, this term. If that's the case, and even to graduate with a master's, you'll still need to do or to enroll this semester. Then first you want to work with the ISSO to amend your SEVIS record to reflect that you're in a master's program, not a PhD program. Through that process, we'll work with you and your department to determine what is your completion date now that you've dropped to a master's. If that completion date is indeed going to be May, then like I said, the completion date for May graduation is May 15th. So yes, you can apply for OPT, not necessarily right now, because as I said, you can't apply any earlier than 90 days from your completion date. So if this is the case for this student and we're able to amend your CVIS record to reflect a master's degree, shorten your I-20 to May 15th, your anticipated completion date, you can apply for OPT as early as February 15th of this year.
Great. Next question. If my F1 visa is currently expired, but I do have a valid I-20, am I still eligible to apply for OPT?
Yes. So you can be in the United States with an expired visa stamp so long as you're otherwise maintaining F1 status. So even though your visa stamp may be expired, so long as you otherwise maintain your F1 status, you have a valid I-20, you can still apply for OPT. I know what spooks a lot of students is the fact that they have to include a copy of their visa with their application. It's totally fine that your visa is expired. As long as you've, like I said, been maintaining your F1 status, you're eligible to apply. The fact that your visa is expired is the vast majority of scenarios irrelevant.
Thank you. Next question. What should I do if my OPT EAD card arrives before 3 months? And what if I do not have a job?
Well, if you get your card before, in advance of a 90-day processing window, that's good. On that card will be the start date you've requested, likely. If that date has already passed, then you have 90 days of unemployment from that date in which you must find a job. If, for example, you get your card and your start date isn't for another few weeks, those 90 days of unemployment won't actually start until the card is valid. So until the start date of the card. So that's a key distinction to make. Your unemployment, that 90 days of unemployment, will not start until the start date of your card. So to answer this question, you'll likely have 90 days or even more in some cases to find work. And I can see this, rather than you read all this question, Emily, I can just read it here. So the student has questions about various messages that are in job advertisements and is it eligible for OPT workers? It says one of the considerations may be that the candidate is eligible to work in the U.S. and won't require visa sponsorship. Applicants for this position may have to go through an export licensing review. Visa sponsorship is not available. Is sponsorship available? No. So to answer the first one, OPT, I guess theoretically, it does not require visa sponsorship. You're still on a UMass Lowell F1 visa, and it does not require the employer to file for presumably an H-1B, which is what really they're referring to for visa sponsorship. As far as export licensing review, I'd probably defer to the employer itself, or maybe the applicant, you the student, as to what exactly that job is. I mean, some jobs, based on the sensitivity of materials or the research or the job itself, may be limited to U.S. citizens or permanent residents alike, and there's really nothing you can do to get around that if you're an F1 student on OPT. If the job does not allow visa sponsorship, you should theoretically be able to work for them pursuant to your OPT, but what they're saying there is we will not pay for and sponsor an H-1B visa. So they may be willing to employ you through the expiry of your OPT, but they're saying that they likely will not file for an H-1B for you. So those jobs are theoretically possible to take. Just I'd want you to temper your expectations as far as your long-term options with those jobs.
Okay, next question here. Do I have to have a job to apply for OPT?
No, and most students don't, because as I said, your students are applying typically months in advance of actually graduating. So no, unlike CPT where you have to have a job in order to apply for it, OPT, you do not have to have a job. You're applying for a period of work authorization, not for work at a specific place. So no, the vast majority of students do not have job offers when they apply for OPT, and no, you do not need a job offer to apply.
Great. Does the 90-day unemployment clock apply after the 60-day grace period or before?
The 90 days of unemployment starts from the start date of your card, whenever that is.
Great. If they issue me OPT and I was unemployed for 90 days, is it deductible from the 12 months?
I think there's maybe a potential misunderstanding there. You have 90 days within that 12-month period in which you can be unemployed. So I think what you may be asking is if you've exceeded your unemployment time and someone offers you a job, can you go work? I would say no. Even though your CVIS record may be still active because ICE hasn't terminated it yet, they can and likely will at any given moment terminate your record based on the expiry of your 90 days. Not to mention, if you were to go work, having exceeded those 90 days, you're working knowing that you violated your status already. So there's likely some legal issues coming your way when and if USCIS notices that. So I would tell a student if you've exceeded your 90 days of unemployment or are close to exceeding your 90 days, consult an attorney as far as your options are concerned. You may want to plan to leave the United States, go back to school. You may have some options, but if you're going to come to us for advice about that, I would tell a student, don't wait until day 89. Come to us well in advance so we can help assess your options.
Excellent. Is it possible to get the OPT EAD card and travel outside of the US before employment?
Yes. Like I said, it's important to have the card before you travel. But when you do travel and come back, theoretically, you want to come back before your OPT start date, even though you don't necessarily have to. You just want to be sure that you understand that any time spent out of the United States and not working counts against your unemployment. So you just want to be sure that you're back in the United States with your card in hand before the expiry of that 90 days. CBP may ask you questions about where you're working and how you're maintaining your status, at which point you can either say, hey, I have an approved EAD card, I'm coming back to work, or I have X amount of unemployment days available and I'm here to seek employment.
Excellent. What if I'm done with my course before May?
Well, then you should apply for OPT based on whatever that completion date is. So if you're finishing I know I dealt with a student who completed this program in March. His last required academic component was ending as March, which is rare, but it was the case in the student's case. In that case, we shortened his I-20 to that completion date in March, and he's since applied for OPT based on that date. So it's key to determine what your completion date is, if not May, and then to apply for OPT based on that. This is a very specific question. So if this is that student and you're confused about when you should apply or what you should be doing, by all means, give us a call during advising hours and we can discuss that further.
How long how long is the OPT authorization for students with a STEM major? And a follow-up question, can you work part-time in OPT?
So the total amount of OPT a student can get while a STEM major is that 36 months. So that's the first 12 months, and then you may be eligible to apply for the additional 24-month extension of that. Part-time work, well, I suppose it depends on how you want to define part-time, but on OPT and STEM OPT, you must be working at least 20 hours per week.
Okay. 20 hours per week is for one job or for all jobs working at once combined?
Sure. So while on your first 12 months of post OPT, you need to be working 20 hours per week in total between all jobs. But if you go on STEM OPT, in order to be eligible, all the jobs that you're applying for STEM OPT based on must all be at least 20 hours. So post OPT, 20 hours total. When on STEM OPT, all jobs must be 20 hours or more.
What would be the flexibility for PhD/thesis students in regards to the completion date, specifically if the defense would be delayed by, say, 2 to 4 weeks?
Well, the current university policy allows for students' completion date to be anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks from their defense. So if you were defending in, say, April or something like that, you could be defending on X date and your completion date be 2 to 4 weeks beyond that. So that's where that flexibility lies. Again, this is a very specific question and it varies from student to student. So if this student wants to discuss what his completion date should be or what is appropriate, by all means, shoot us an email or give us a call during advising.
Excellent. Can you start a new degree while working on post-OPT?
No, so you cannot be enrolled or engaged in a degree program while on post-OPT, and quite frankly, you should not be taking any classes while on post-OPT. The regulations are too vague when describing that, so I would typically advise students not to be taking classes while on post-OPT. If you decide to go back to school, you can do that, but that university would have to issue you a new I-20, and at the time that record was CVIS registered during the first term of that new program, your OPT would then be invalid. But in general, no, you cannot be engaged in a new program of study while on OPT.
Excellent. Okay, what if you were taking classes full-time classes from your home country right now?
I think the student has to clarify what they mean by that. That could
Like,
mean, I could go about many different directions with what that could potentially mean for you. So if that student wants to just clarify what they mean by that, I'm happy to answer that.
I read that as like if you're outside of the US right now, are you eligible to apply for OPT?
I would say no. The SCVP guidance does not explicitly say that you're eligible to. So until that happens, the regulations state that you have to be in the United States to apply for OPT. This is especially important for those who may be outside the United States now, who are graduating in May. If you do want to apply for OPT, you're going to have to make plans to come to the United States because you can't apply for OPT from outside the US.
Sort of a similar but different question. I'm currently outside of the US and I'll return to the US next week. I'm a graduate student in my last semester. And my question is, do I qualify for OPT application as per the one full academic year on active CVIS status rule?
Well, that would depend on if your CVIS record was previously activated. So the COVID guidance allowed continuing students who were enrolled as of March 9th, 2020 to engage in a fully online course load, whether in the United States or abroad. In which case, if you fall into that boat, we've likely kept your CVIS record active. So you're even though you're outside the United States, you're still accruing time, or maybe have already accrued the time necessary to apply for OPT. So in this, well, this student should certainly reach out to us so we can confirm that that is indeed the case. It likely is, and as long as you're back in the United States and in active CVIS status and had previously accrued a one full academic year, you're likely eligible for OPT. But this student should certainly reach out to us just to confirm.
Excellent. Does the 90-day unemployment clock accrue over the STEM extension period?
Nope. So you get 90 days during your first 12 months of OPT, and when and if you go on to STEM OPT, you're given another 60 days that is added to whatever time you had left from the 90. So if you weren't unemployed at all during your first 12 months of OPT, once your STEM OPT extension starts, you're looking at a total of 150 days of unemployment.
Is the denial rate high for self-employment? As an example, starting a business in my field of study.
Well, the denial wouldn't come at the OPT stage because when you're applying for post OPT, you're just applying for work authorization. Because we know you can be self-employed while on post OPT, that shouldn't be an issue. What issue you might face, however, is when and if you apply for a STEM extension based on self-employment. It'll likely be impossible to evidence that there is an employer-employee relationship if you're essentially the boss. So although it's sad, the STEM OPT regulations don't really allow for entrepreneurship and self-employment. So while that may work for your first 12-month period of OPT, it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to apply for your STEM extension based on self-employment.
Great. How do I make sure that the company that gave me the offer of employment is enrolled in E-Verify?
You can ask them. There's theoretically a database online where you could potentially look them up, but I found when students have asked me to check that it's a very finicky system. But by all means, you can ask human resources at that employer, and they can confirm whether they're E-Verified or not. The ISIS students often ask if we know. We won't know. So you can just ask the employer directly.
Great. Is remote work allowed for post OPT?
Particularly during COVID times, yes. But even before COVID, it would be permitted. We would just tell you to document or to keep documentation from you, your employer, whomever, to evidence how that employment arrangement is being met. So how you're being supervised, even remotely, et cetera. But in general, yes, it's fine.
Okay, great. When to apply for OPT? You apply for OPT if you are graduating in August.
You can apply for OPT as early as 90 days from your completion date. So whatever date in August your final class is ending, 90 days prior to that.
Can I travel after I have submitted my application for the EAD, but before my program completion date?
Theoretically, yes. Although, as I said, it's risky. I mean, in general, and every time you submit an application to USCIS, you probably should not travel in case there's issues with the application that you'd have to address from within the United States. But technically speaking, a student could apply for OPT, let's say in February, leave the US the next day, come back in April, and then be here, be on the expedited I-20 while their OPT is being processed. Technically, that's possible. It's riskier now more than ever because of travel restrictions, potential future travel restrictions that may prevent you from getting back in time. So I would hate for you to think you're just going to leave the country for a little bit and be back in time and then be stuck and therefore forfeit your OPT. So I'll tell the student, yes, it's possible, but very risky. And if this is your plan, I would strongly encourage you to discuss that with an advisor so we can assess any and all risks.
Could we please have a copy of your slides?
Yeah, this presentation is being recorded, so we'll be able to disseminate that to you.
Yes, and I did previously answer a student. We will be posting the recording to the forms and guides section of the website as well. So 20 hours per week. We did already answer this question. Yes, 20 hours per week combined with all jobs. What if I apply for the EAD at the end of April and I receive it after 3 months? Will it deduct from the 1 year of OPT?
Yeah, so potentially. So your OPT, I should say your OPT end date cannot be any later than a year from the end of your 60-day grace period. So what I mean by that is if your grace period would end in July 15th and you applied late for OPT, and let's just say you didn't get your card until August 1st. In that sense, your OPT card would be valid from August 1st, 2021 to July 14th, 2022. So in that sense, you would be potentially losing OPT time. So that's the risk you run applying late. But if you're a STEM major, it's likely inconsequential because you have the the STEM OPT eligibility. But yes, to answer your question, if you applied late, there is a potential of you, I guess, not being approved for a full 12 months of OPT.
Can I do more than 40 hours per week with the job related to my field? Is there a maximum amount of hours per week?
Yeah, the guidance references 40 hours because it's a standard work week, but there's nothing that necessarily limits you to 40 hours. So by all means, if you want to work more than 40 hours, you can do that. You can work overtime. There's nothing in the regulations about that, as long as you're working at least 20 hours a week.
Excellent. I'm a PhD student. I obtained a master's degree last fall and I plan on obtaining my PhD this summer. I apply for OPT for both degrees.
Good question, but no. You can't essentially bank OPT time. You would have to have applied for OPT within 60 days of any program completion. So since we're now presumably past that for the master's degree, that OPT is off the table for now. You'd be eligible to apply for the 12 months of OPT based on completion of the PhD. And assuming it's a STEM degree, again, you would have the 24-month STEM extension eligibility. But no, you can't now apply for that master's OPT now that you're on a PhD program.
Thank you. What if I am graduating in August and indicated my job starts in September? Would that be possible? Do you see any problem here?
No, I don't see a problem here. If your completion date is in August, you have to pick an OPT start date within 60 days of that date. So September certainly falls within that. I would just tell that student when applying for OPT to request that start date within September. Yeah, no problems there.
I'm a PhD candidate. I'm not sure if I will be graduating in May or August. Should I apply for OPT now?
No, absolutely not. As I said, when you apply for OPT, you want to be very confident that you are graduating when you say you're graduating, because if, for example, that completion date were to change, the process of withdrawing your OPT can likely complicate matters, if not create status issues for you. So I would tell a student to maybe wait until they are more confident as to when they're graduating and then apply for OPT at that time.
If I already have a job, can I straight up apply for H-1B even though I haven't finished my degree, or do I have to be on OPT to apply for H-1B?
You can't apply for an H-1B. Unlike OPT, which is your application to the government, an H-1B is an employer's application on your behalf. So to answer your question, theoretically, an employer could file for an H-1B for you now, based on a prior degree you may have earned, but that's probably unlikely if you haven't yet worked for them. The most common tract is you would go work for an employer on OPT. They realize that you're a good employee rather, and then pony up the money to apply for your H-1B. But I mean, legally speaking, an employer could file for H-1B now, but it's unlikely. In most cases, you're going to be on OPT working, and at that point, an employer will file an H-1B for you.
Will we have to apply for a new F1 visa after traveling outside of the US with our EID, of course, with an expired visa? Can one apply for an F1 visa on the grounds of OPT and not actual enrollment in a school?
Yep. So you're still an F1 student, even while on OPT. So if you travel out of the United States while on OPT with an expired F1 visa, you will need a new F1 visa in order to come back. And yes, when you do apply for that F1 visa, you're applying for it based on the fact that you're still on F1 status, albeit on your OPT.
Right. Correct me if I'm wrong. If I plan to go back to my country after 1 year of work, I can answer no to the answer about needing sponsorship or not.
I suppose that's again, it's more of an ethical question, but I suppose that's the honest and correct answer, that no, you, based on your plans, will not require visa sponsorship. So sure, I don't see a problem with that.
When should I apply for OPT in my case? So I believe that this was the student that indicated that they were currently outside of the US. So they're asking when can they apply for OPT if they're going to be graduating this semester?
Well, assuming they're graduating in May, and I don't know that we know that for sure, you'd have to be in the United States to do that. You can apply for OPT as early as February 15th or in or about February 15th, because that's 90 days completion. But again, the key for you is that you need to be in the United States in order to do that.
Great, thank you. If I already have a job, can I okay.
I think we already got that, yeah.
Look at, yep. So we're just gonna get rid of that. Okay, somebody's just saying thank you for this session.
Oh, you're welcome.
I'm late to the session. Will there be a recording? Yes, there will be a recording. We're recording now, and we will post that probably within a week or two to the forums and guide section of the website. Okay, we do have 1 or 2 more questions. If I finish my current degree, then have a period of OPT, and then I decide to go back to school for PhD. Can I apply for OPT again to work, or do I have to get an H-1B to work in the US?
So you get 12 months, at least 12 months of OPT per degree level. So you could theoretically finish your current degree, go off and work on OPT, come back to school for your PhD, finish your PhD, and then again apply for OPT, even up to 3 years of OPT if it's a STEM degree, before needing to go on to an H-1B. So no, you don't have to go right from an H-1B after your PhD. You'll have more OPT available to you after your PhD.
Excellent. Looks like we have a final question here. I am graduating this May. When is the most suitable time to apply for OPT?
You can apply as early as 90 days before your completion date. So that's in or around mid-February. That's the earliest you can do it. I would typically advise students to apply more or less as soon as you're able to. If not, if not the end of February, early March is probably something good to shoot for.
Great, thank you. Okay, it looks like we do have a question about CPT. So the CPT session is going to be in a couple of weeks. You will receive that information to your student email address when the CPT session is going to be coming. It looks like on March 19th, Friday, March 19th at 3 p.m., there will be a CPT session.
And I would say in general, because I see the question here, self-employment will not be permitted on CPT, no. It's be too hard to justify that that's integral to your academic program. So just for the sake of answering that question in a very brief way, not possible.
Great. Okay, we do have another question here. Is it fine that my employer for OPT is the same as my employer for CPT?
Sure, yeah, and that's kind of what you're looking for, right? That you go work for this company as an internship, and then they want to hire you long term once you graduate. So by all means, yeah, that's totally fine. As long as it's in your field of study, at least 20 hours a week, totally fine. So with that, I think that's all the questions. Thank you. They were all very good questions. I hope you enjoyed this. Like I said, this is recorded, so we'll have it updated on the website soon. The STEM OPT coffee hour is in 2 weeks, so be sure to attend that if you are a STEM major and are interested in the STEM process. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great weekend, and let us know if you have any questions during advising hours. We're happy to help you. Thanks, Emily, and thanks everyone for attending. Have a nice weekend.